Chapter 4. Unknowable years later, something finally happened. Light burst into existence around her, blinding her. The world flickered, and the light condensed into lines that raced in from all around her, flowing together to form the neon grid of the digital void she had originally found herself in. Suddenly, as if an enormous weight was released, she found she could breathe again, and she sucked in a huge lungful of air, pain shooting through her as she did so, as feeling and sensation returned. From below and above, points of light appeared, filling in around her, locking into place as cubes of matter. It was over in seconds, the world building itself up around her, pieces of the house and furniture appearing pixel by pixel. Mortimer came in piece by piece, assembled in front of her like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. If she could process her thoughts, Alpha would have guessed that this was exactly where he had been before everything had vanished. Physics suddenly reasserted itself, catching her off guard, and she slumped to the floor without the strength to hold herself up any longer. Would be a rather serious issue, Mortimer finished. He blinked and looked down at April in confusion. Are you alright? You just collapsed. Are you unwell? He knelt beside her, and when she could not seem to respond, patted her face gently. Are you still there, Alpha? A slow blink was her only response. The crosses of her eyes seemed blurred and unfocused as Mortimer waved his hands before her. With his meagre attempts at first aid proving useless, Mortimer resorted to the only option he had which had worked so far. He scooped her up easily and dropped her onto the sofa to recover, and busied himself with small chores around the house. He was at a loss for what else he could do, as one moment Alpha had been standing in front of him as normal as can be, and then suddenly the world had twitched and she had collapsed in front of him. He guessed it had to be something to do with her being a player, or some side effect of these new powers she had been showing off to him. Whatever it was, he would have to talk to her about them when she had recovered more fully. The day passed by slowly, Alpha staying put where she was. Everything ached and her head was swimming. A thick fog filled her thoughts, and she tried and failed to process what had happened. Nothing came to her, and gradually, in time, she drifted away into an unnatural sleep. Mortimer faced through the wall, staring straight ahead. It would have been easier if you had not done this to me, he muttered before melting back into the wall, wallpaper flowing around his features like water. Alpha rose from the sofa, the world around her shifting and bending as she moved. Taking a step forward, her foot disappeared over the horizon before the floor rushed up to meet her face. It was like the worst fever dream she had ever experienced. The world flexing and shuddering around her. Silhouettes shifted in and out of sight, and she wandered ever-expanding corridors. Certain she knew where she was, but never finding a familiar sight. Her parents appeared before her. It's such a shame, said her mother. You can only blame yourself, said her father, before they both turned into twisted Picasso paintings and faded from view. More and more figures from her past appeared, making accusations, telling her how disappointed they were with her. Over and over the words came, louder and louder, and she fled from them, running through the warping landscape. But the voices followed, mocking in their insistence that she was a failure. On and on they came, louder and louder, ignoring her protests, her desperate defences doing nothing to lessen them. Just leave me alone, she cried, but this echoed around her, gaining volume and mixing with the cacophony of sounds that surrounded her. Further and further she went, blind now to the twists and turns as she barreled down the warping corridors. At full sprint, she rounded one last corridor, stepping into the bright light before she could slow herself, and sat up in a cold sweat. Her hands flew up to her face and ripped the headset from her head, her eyes taking a moment to adjust to the sudden darkness of the room around her. Kaboom! Kaboom! The noise was deafening as it thudded over and over, and she took a moment to realize it was the hammering of her heart in her ears. She gulped down a few more lungfuls of air to steady herself, looking down at her hands holding the headset. She realized that before her eyes, real hands, skin and fingernails exactly where they should be. The light blue tones of her nail polish she had applied the night before, holding the offending headset tightly. She threw it away from herself, across the room, its delicate connections and pads smashing to pieces as it bounced under her computer desk. The monitor up on the desk flickered. A copy of the My Sims game paused, unmoving. Was it finally over? Had this been a fever dream gone bad while she was using her headset? She pulled herself up from the floor, wiping the sweat from her forehead. The feel of her face was reassuringly familiar to her touch, and she almost choked in relief to feel it again. Whatever it was that had caused this, she knew she would now swear off virtual reality headsets for life after this, and would probably need to sign herself up to a number of therapy sessions to talk through everything that she had just been through. Looking closer at the screen, she could see the My Sims house laid out in front of her, just as she had seen it before. On closer inspection of the screen, she could see the My Sims house laid out in front of her, just as it had been in her dream. Mortimer standing next to his bed, having just gotten up, and a strange stack of ovens along the side of the building, a shower in the garden, and the sitting room. In the sitting room, he froze. On the screen, he was lying on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket provided by Mortimer. And in the air above the house, a black mass hung frozen like the rest of the world. Scanning the screen, trying to take in every tiny detail, I was dragged back to the black shape. Did it have those white specks on it before? Leaning in closer to get a better look, the monitor flashed to black, and in its reflective surface, her blocky digital face looked back at her. The look of surprise painted across it was almost comical, if it was not such a horrific thing to see. Screamed and awoke. Mortimer was putting the finishing touches to his outfit for the day, and jumped as he heard the crash from downstairs. Hurrying down, he ran into the sitting room to find the blankets tangled around Alpha's feet as she flailed and tried to get up. "Hold still, my dear." He helped Alpha untangle herself and get to her feet. She did not stop to thank him and rushed outside into the front garden. Surprised by her sudden burst of activity, Mortimer followed her. "What had you so worked up?" he called after her. Alpha stood in the front garden, pointing up into the sky. That! Hanging in the air, suspended by rippling lights, a black oozing mass dripped flecks of darkness. As they watched, the very air rippled as the specks fell, and where they landed, the house jittered and sputtered. "What is that?" Mortimer staggered backwards, fear etched across his face at the sight of the unknown. Alpha shook her head, not sure how to respond. Before they could talk further, the black ooze shook, convulsing and twisting. Bending around, the morphing shape flowed through itself. 3 white masks spun around its body, coming to rest in a triangular formation. Each was a mirror of Alpha's own face, but cracked in different ways, and as they steadied in their places, they seemed to focus on Alpha and Mortimer. Alpha glanced at Mortimer and caught his eye. "I think it's looking at us," he uselessly pointed out the obvious. The mask's 6 eyes blazed with flashing kaleidoscopic light, and its body twisted further, revealing a gaping maw, from which a hideous, rending scream emitted. It detached from the sky, and the monstrosity fell, smashing through the house as if it was nothing. With a rending crash, the walls of the house exploded into glitching fragments as the creature pushed its mass towards the terrified pair. "Run!" Alpha screamed and took off in one direction as Mortimer fled in the other. Ignoring Mortimer, the creature charged directly for Alpha, the scream emitting from it not slowing for a moment. Alpha was running out of room as he tried to run. He was cornered by the monster against the house's barrier, and in a moment of desperation, she thrust out her hand and purchased oven after oven, trying to create a barrier. The monster thrashed wildly, the ovens appearing all around it, but offering little more than a distraction. Its touch was shattering each one as it appeared into digital code fragments. She had slowed it, but barely. Concentrating hard, her other hand began to spawn more ovens, stacking them up to make a ladder to safety, and she began to climb up and away from the monster. With her focus momentarily broken, the monster surged forward again, destroying all of the bottom ovens in its rage. Alpha had to thank the original game's developers for not adding physics to the items, and she stood looking down on the creature that was now thrashing wildly below her. Its screams were terrible to hear, ripping through the air to cut deep into her mind. There was something familiar about them, but she did not have any time to put any thought into it. Folding in on itself, the lashing tendrils began to pull back in on themselves, and then, with a heightened squeal, it lashed out in a single huge tendril, punching a hole straight through the oven which was currently supporting Alpha. She squeaked in terror and leapt from her oven as it disintegrated out from under her feet. It was an ill-timed jump, but it was enough, as she crashed onto the damaged house roof, scrambling for purchase on its smooth tiles. Mortimer's voice carried up to her. "Alpha, is that you on the roof?" She caught a foot on the gutter and pulled herself up to peer through the hole in the ceiling. Mortimer was hiding in the bedroom. "Mortimer, I think it's after me for some reason." "Of course it is, my dear. You seem to be attracting quite a lot of unusual things today." He was clearly upset at the situation, which was not an unreasonable response given the hole in his house and the pressing imminent danger he was in. The monster roared in fury as it continued to smash its way through the ground floor of the house, impotent in its rage and inability to climb up to the first floor to reach them both. "What can we do?" Alpha called down to Mortimer. The alarm clock on the bedside table trilled, announcing it was 8 a.m. and time to get ready to leave the house for work. Mortimer stared at it, his face grim. "Well, my dear, I have an idea, but I'm not going to like it." "What is it?" Before he could respond to her question, another tendril whipped up, lashing through the floor. Without another word, Mortimer pulled open the bedroom window and dived through as the bed glitched out of existence. He hit the ground hard and staggered up, trying to run at full speed towards the road where the carpool was waiting. The monster howled and writhed its tendrils, giving chase. Mortimer reached the car with a moment to spare, performing the robotic motion of opening the door and climbing into the car. The barrier of the plot seemed to be the one thing the monster could not easily pass through, and it spread out wider and wider as it tried to find a way through. From her vantage point, Alpha could see Mortimer sitting in the passenger seat of the idling car, locked into the sitting position. His face was the only thing moving, and it was not a happy-looking expression that played across it. The moments passed, and just as the car was about to leave, the monster twisted again, bending and folding in on itself. Before her eyes, Alpha watched as it contorted into the shape of a person, and repeated the robotic motion Mortimer had performed just moments before. This was the moment Mortimer had been waiting for, and as the creature was locked in the animation of opening the car door and climbing in, Mortimer tumbled out, and not a moment too soon. The car engine revved and took off down the road and out of the house's lot. Alpha hit the floor and staggered over to Mortimer. "You did it!" She cheered as she helped pull him up to his feet. "That was a brilliant move." "I just hope it likes the void as much as I did," he smiled, brushing his suit jacket down. He looked back at the house. "I can fix it," Alpha said, less than certainly. "But I'm sure that thing will be back." "I'm sure it will be, but we have 8 hours to work out what to do next." Unfortunately for the pair, it turned out to be much less than 8 hours of safety. As they picked their way through the devastation, both Alpha and Mortimer were given a rude awakening to the danger they truly were in, as the entire ground floor began to buck and sway beneath them. "What now?" Alpha cried in angry frustration, which quickly turned to fear as she watched the floor begin to discolor and corrupt before their eyes. "Quickly, we need another ladder." Mortimer grabbed her shoulder and spun her around. "There!" Followed his finger and automatically raised her hand to build another pile of furniture for them to climb, away from the buckling floor. They scrambled up, over the ovens, sofas, and other pieces of the house to climb away from the floor that was beginning to lose all of its color beneath them. Alpha had a horrible feeling she could guess what was about to happen to it. The terrible screams rang out once more, confirming her fears, and they both redoubled their efforts. It only took a few moments to reach, but before them was the pulsing circle in the air, the same one which he had come through originally. Below them, the very earth the house stood on blackened and twisted as the creature's corrupting influence spread. Being outside of the house had not taken it away from them. It had given it direct access to the very core of the game itself. "Quickly!" Mortimer cried and formed his hands into a cradle. With his help, Alpha boosted herself up and through the shimmering hole. She was suddenly back in the glitched out and broken Mysim's house in the void, where she had fallen through the shower all those days ago. Alpha grabbed the edge of the shower and quickly thrust her head and arm back through the floor. Below, Mortimer balanced precariously on the final oven as the black tentacles thrashed through the remains of the house. "Take my hand!" she shouted, and Mortimer reached up to take hold. She heaved with all of her strength. He was heavy, much heavier than any digital character had any right to be, and it took everything she had not to drop him. "You'll have to climb up," she groaned under his weight, unable to lift him by herself. He nodded and began to pull himself up, hand over hand. "Grab the lip of the hole when you can." It took all of her strength just to hold onto her handhold in the void, and her arms were beginning to shake from the strain. Mortimer thrust his arm up to pull himself through into the void, but to both his and her horror, his hand struck the hole like it was a physical object, and he flailed, nearly losing his grip in the process. "I can't get through!" he shouted as his hand pressed against the sky. Below them, the house was beginning to completely deform and flickered in and out of existence as the corruption spread. Mortimer dangled helplessly from Alpha's hand, the pile of furniture they had climbed disintegrating below him. He looked her in the eye, glanced down, and back up again. "Well, my dear?" A sad smile played across his features. "I think it might be time for me to step out." And without giving Alpha time to respond, he let go. Time slowed as she cried out, surprised by Mortimer's sudden act of selflessness. Mortimer plunged down, his eyes and smile never wavering as they stayed locked with Alpha's. Color drained from the world, and in a rush, Alpha realized it was not just a dramatic moment, but before her, the world had really stopped moving. "Now's my chance," she thought to herself, and she reached out a hand to try and summon something, anything, to catch Mortimer. Appearing from nowhere, a stark red searchlight passed over her, freezing her in place in fear. Glancing up, she saw a silhouette figure hovering in the sky out beyond the game's edge, bright lights emanating from where she assumed its eyes would be. A hand extended out, and before she knew what was happening, a crushing weight dragged on her. It felt as if someone had turned up the gravity of the world below her, and it took everything she had not to be pulled down with it. She braced herself, and with an enormous effort, she ripped herself back and up through the hole in the shower's floor. There was no time to rest, though, as it quickly became evident that this was not a safe space. Even here, outside of the game, she could feel the pressing weight beginning to pull on her again. Staggering to her feet, she pulled herself with slow, painful steps out of the glitched house, until suddenly, as she stepped over the glowing grid lines of the void, the pressure vanished and she collapsed forward, thrown off by the sudden release. Lying on the ground, she looked back to the house, and watched as the entire area of the childhood video game house began to sink down, the entire area dropping into the void below her. Just as fast as it had begun, it was over, and the neon grid of the void snapped back into place, as smooth and flat as if there had never been anything there to begin with. Deleted forever. The reality of what she was seeing slowly dawned on her. There was nothing for it. Part of her childhood was gone, and the one comforting presence she had had since arriving in this nightmare realm was gone with it. She was alone again, the digital void stretching out from her in all directions, cold and featureless.